Hey there, in today's video we're going to study the fantastic fight between former world champions Viswanathan Anand, also known as Vishy, and Magnus Carlsen. They met a few days ago at the Global Chess League in Dubai, and I want to start with this position because this is a moment where the excitement starts. So here we have a very complex ending with bishop against knight. We have a lot of imbalances, but we could see that black is already attacking this pawn h5, so the knight on g3 has to be defending this pawn, and black is trying to get active with the king. And here in this position, Carlsen played the move b4, already trying to fight for an advantage, and Carlsen is arguably the best ending player ever, but I think that his greatest skill in this game was his fighting spirit. Now this is a very complicated position and it was a rapid game, so both players didn't have a lot of time to analyze variation, and here instead of going for b4, there was a subtle maneuver with the bishop before playing this idea. So here a very strong idea was to go bishop to c6, and then bring the bishop to e8, for example after king to a3, bishop to e8. Now the bishop is still attacking the pawn h5, and here we see that white doesn't have a lot of moves. Here the knight is tied down, and after a move like king to b2, now black can go for this idea of b4. This is a very subtle ending, and you might not understand why a bishop on e8 is better than a bishop on f3, but we're going to understand this very clearly after we see the game continuation. So here Carlsen played the move b4, and here again white doesn't have a lot of moves, so taking on b4 makes a lot of sense. And now we see the surprising idea of Magnus, which is not to capture the pawn on b4, even though this wins another pawn after taking on b4, because here after c3 and king takes a5, even though black is a pawn up, white is trying to set a fortress, just waiting and not allowing the black's king to enter white's position. For example, after king to a2 and king to a4, white can simply wait without allowing the black's king to enter, and this position looks like a draw because there doesn't seem any way for black to progress. The king also cannot enter this way because the e4 square is controlled by the knight. So Carlsen's idea was to go king to d4, so black is sacrificing a pawn in order to infiltrate white's position. One idea might be to go king to e3 and then capture the pawn f4, or even go king to f2, attacking the knight on g3. But as we see, white will have a lot of interesting resources in this position. So here Vishy went c3. There was also an idea by black to play c3, that's why c3 makes a lot of sense. And now we'll see Magnus in his element. Even though the position might be balanced, he will play the most practical moves that will invite white to go wrong. Here he played the move king to d3, and the idea is that after king to e3, white has a very forcing continuation, which is knight takes f5. So we'll see this idea a lot. In this particular position, it gives a check, so it's quite forcing. And after pawn takes, here white gets the move b5, which is another typical idea that we see in this position. Now let's imagine that we had a bishop on e8. After b5, black would simply capture with the bishop and not allow white to create another pass pawn. But in this particular position, after b5 and pawn takes, white sacrifices a piece, but white gets two strong pass pawns. And we're going to analyze very similar positions where black gets the king on d3, which as we'll see is an improved version for black. So that's why here Magnus anticipated this idea of knight takes f5 and went king to d3. As we'll see, the king is going to be better placed there. And in this position, white is on the defensive. The pawn on c3 is being attacked. The pawn h5 is also being attacked. So if the king or the knight move, white will lose material. But Anand's idea was to play in a very forcing way and go b5, which is an idea that we have already seen. And after pawn takes, go a6, just pushing the pass pawn. So here black has to be a bit careful. Black has to get very concrete counterplay here. And the idea is to go b4 to create a pass pawn. But in this particular position, going b4 straight away is actually quite bad because after pawn takes and c3, the king goes to c1 and there's no way to push the king out of c1. That's why Carlsen went king to d2. So now that the c1 square is covered, b4 is the main threat. That's why white has to be, again, very concrete. So white went a7, and now Carlsen again played a very practical move. He didn't want to force white, because after the move b4, here white will not take on b4 because after c3 the c-pawn will promote, but white has this idea of knight to f1, giving a check and driving the king away from d2, and white is holding this position. For example, after king to e2, knight to g3, gives another check, and black doesn't have anything better than going back to d2. So here Magnus played the move bishop to d5, which looks like a waiting move. One idea might be to control the a2 square after b4 and c3. But this invites white to make a move. And here Vishy made a decisive mistake and went knight takes f5. We saw this idea in another position, but here it will not work. But again, it's going to be very hard to see everything in advance. Again, knight to f1, giving a check and trying to drive the king away from d2 was the saving idea for white. But knight takes f5 looks very attractive because after pawn takes, now white goes e6. And if black captures on e6, white will simply promote. That's why black has to be very accurate and go b4, trying to create a pass pawn himself. And here Anand went e7, taking on b4 now is not very good for white because after c3, white only has 2 squares to go, and black will promote with check. For example, after king to a3, c2, c1 will promote the queen with check before white promotes. That's why Vishy correctly played the move e7, and after pawn takes, king to a2. In this crazy position, Vishy's idea was not to promote with the e-pawn because after c3, given a check, the king has to move, and now black will promote with check. And basically here black will combine the attack on the king and also push the c-pawn. So this should be a win for black. For example, after king to b4, black can play c2. If white promotes, white will simply give the bishop for the queen. And now black has this idea to go queen to b2 and then promote. But Vishy's idea was to go a8 queens. So this is a very deep idea, and we're going to understand it in a few seconds. But before that, let's see his reaction after he played this move over the board. Okay, so let's go back to the game. Here, one of the ideas is that if black promotes, then white will capture the bishop with check. That's why black has to capture the queen, and now white can promote the e-pawn. And this position might look like a favorable position for black at first sight because after black promotes, if white captures the bishop, now this c-pawn will decide the game. But here Vishy's idea was to find a very pretty stalemate after queen to e3, and we now see that this pawn on c4 is controlling the b3 square. That's why after king takes, we get a stalemate. Or after king to c2, white has to be a bit careful. White still gives checks. For example, after queen to d3, if king takes, we get a stalemate. Or also after pawn takes, now the king is covering the b3 square, so we also get a stalemate. Instead, in this position, Magnus decided to keep going with the game and play the move bishop to e4, which as we'll see, could have led to a draw. But again, the position is just extremely complicated, and with a few seconds on the clock, finding the best moves in every move here is pretty much impossible. But here black had a very pretty win after the move c3, so it's just a very hard move to play. Because amazingly here, white cannot stop the promotion of the pawn, and white also cannot give perpetual check. So here white captures the bishop, black will promote, and white can give a few checks, but in the long run, this pawn is going to be unstoppable. Or if white tries to give checks without capturing the bishop, for example after queen to d8, the king will go to the e-file and then block the check with bishop to e4. Amazingly, in this position, white doesn't have any checks, and this pawn is going to promote. So playing c3 was just very hard to play. Another idea is that now playing bishop to e4 is definitely a very natural move because now the bishop is protected, and now black will have the same idea of promoting the queen. But now white will still insist with this idea of a stalemate after queen to d8, bishop to e3. In this very critical position, white had to find one move to save the game, which was not easy. Here Vishy played the move queen to d4, which as we'll see will not work. But here white had to play a very similar idea by going queen to b6, which has the idea to sacrifice the queen and reach a stalemate, but additionally white has the idea to capture the pawn h6. So here black promotes to a queen, while still gets the same idea of sacrificing the queen and reaching a stalemate. And if black decides to under-promote, which, spoiler alert, is what Magnus will do in the game, by under-promoting to a knight, this gives a check, and after the king moves, start pushing the c-pawn. In this position, white is in time to get counterplay by capturing the h6 pawn, and after c2 and queen to c6, black will promote this pawn, but after h6, white is getting counterplay. In fact, black is the one who has to be careful in this position to hold the balance. So after queen to b6, black should probably promote to a queen and allow white to force the stalemate. But instead here Vishy played the move queen to d4, which has the same idea of sacrificing the queen if black promotes to a queen. But on the other hand, white doesn't get pressure on the h6 pawn. So this is just a big difference. So here in this position, if black promotes to a queen, white will sacrifice the queen, reaching a stalemate. But Magnus here promotes to a knight, giving a check, and after king to a3, c3, amazingly, black's pieces coordinate very well. For example, here after queen to f2, knight to e2, white doesn't have any more checks, and this pawn will simply promote. And now Vishy finally discovered this important idea of queen to b6, but unfortunately for him, one move too late, because after knight to e2, queen takes, and c2, here he resigned, because white is simply one tempo short. For example, after queen to c6, now black can simply promote, and after queen takes, king takes is a very important move, because after h6, knight takes, this knight is going to be in time to stop the pawn. For example, after h7 and knight to g6, now black will consolidate and get a decisive material advantage. So this was a very sharp fighting ending, where both sides played extremely well considering that they had very little time and how complicated the position was. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a like. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.